It's my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Lauren Smith. So Lauren manages the Evidence Search and Summary Service at the Institute for Research and Innovation in Social Services in Glasgow. And so her work and research focuses on the role of library and information services in supporting people to make informed decisions in their study, work and everyday life. So, Lauren, take it away.
Thanks very much, Georgia.
You're very welcome.
You're probably wondering why a knowledge manager in social services is talking about surveillance. It's because my background is in library and information science, but also research. So my doctorate was around young people's political engagement online and things that have an influence on what they're talking about, what they're searching about, what they're doing, and how they're getting involved in democratic life. Which led me to being involved in the work of various organisations and other people interested in research around freedom of expression, freedom of inquiry. So what I'm drawing on today is related to some research I did with Scottish PEN, which is part of the PEN International Organisation, which is a writers' organisation. They do a lot of work around freedom of expression and international investigative journalism. So I'll talk a bit about how that research has informed what I'm thinking. And I'm finding increasingly that the stuff I was doing in research is relevant to my everyday life and everyday practice. I only have a little bit of experience in academic libraries, but I think this is something that's really important for us to be talking about. I'm really keen to get people thinking about the role of surveillance and the impact it's having on our students, the impact it has on the research that universities are doing, whose voices get heard. So this is the kind of stuff I'm going to be focusing on. So looking over some of the forms of surveillance in higher education, mostly the prevent strategy, but there's so much going on in higher education. I'm sure in the discussion afterwards we'll be bringing out some examples of other types of surveillance. So be thinking, just as I'm talking, about what this looks like in your everyday practice, what this might look like for the students that you're dealing with, for the researchers that you're working with. I'll also be talking about the kind of chilling effect that research is finding that these different forms of surveillance in higher education and in civic life are having on people, and the influence it has on particular demographics and particular groups, and the social justice implications of that. And then talking about our potential professional responses. I've been quite heavily involved in professional bodies since I started working as a librarian. I don't think we're doing enough. I think we need to do more, but I think we need to talk about how we can do that, what that looks like in practice. Excuse me a second. Got all sniffly. So, in terms of surveillance in education, as I said, the main thing is around the Prevent Act. Sorry, not the Act, the Prevent Strategy. So Prevent was set up back in 2006. It's taken various forms since. It's mostly about the aim to stop people becoming terrorists or supporting terrorism. What that looks like in practice now is less on the integration element and making people feel like part of their communities and preventing people from becoming marginalised and feeling like they don't belong in their communities, which was removed back in 2011 by the coalition government. It's now more of a surveillance angle. It's more a duty to report when people look a bit dodgy or might have said something that seems a bit suspicious. So it's about challenging ideologies that support terrorism. What that actually looks like in practice is anti-Muslim, protecting vulnerable people. What that looks like is making small children the subject of suspicion and making their parents seem like they might be creating mini terrorists, and supporting sector institutions where there are risks of radicalisation. So that's about schools, universities and other organisations that are working with young people. So one of the things that's created the kind of negative culture around the Prevent strategy is the Counter-Terrorism and Security Act. So this has now imposed a legal duty on public bodies, including universities, the people who work in them, including librarians, to spot early warning signs of terrorist sympathy and report them to the police. So McGovern's written about this in terms of how this is a form of surveillance on students. People are looking at students as suspects. They are looking at the material they're reading as being potentially to do with terrorist activity and not to do with freedom of inquiry and investigating and exploring different ideas. And it's not very popular. There are some places that have just taken it on board uncritically and said, yes, this is what we have to legally do. There are different degrees of training that academic staff and other types of staff in universities have been undergoing. Theoretically, everybody should have been trained. I don't know, a bit of a show of hands, who knows about Prevent and its existence? I mean, obviously, you're here because it's relevant. But who's been on training? I mean, yeah. So I'll ask afterwards when you've got a mic in terms of what your training was like and what your experiences were like of it. Research and reporting on it is indicating there are really different levels of quality of the training, of the type of information people have, of how people feel when they come out of it. And it ain't great. Like, people aren't feeling good about it a lot of the time. And there are concerns. So there's a link to an open letter that's been signed by academics who view this legislation as unnecessary, ill-conceived, in conflict with academic freedom. And that's the thing. It's about this balancing the importance of academic freedom, investigating, writing about things that are challenging, and the fact that this legislation is making people feel very uncomfortable, and there's a possibility that it's having a silencing effect. So Full Fact have reported on kind of a fact check on it. It's not just scaremongering. People are talking about how this rule is having a dividing, stigmatising and alienating effect on segments of the population. Because although theoretically Prevent is supposed to be an equal opportunity surveillance, where it's targeting anybody regardless of whether or not they're Muslim, and it's supposed to be looking at right-wing extremism from, for example, white nationalists, it's disproportionately affecting Muslim communities and Muslim families across the UK. And I think we need to be looking at where libraries are potentially complicit in this, and where libraries have a role to play within the university as a wider organisation. So universities have been neoliberalised. This is nothing new. The discourse around having to implement the Prevent Act is a lot of the time around we need to make sure that we as an institution are doing the right thing, that we have a good reputation. But McGovern argues that this is about becoming a mask of compliance and censorship. So we're potentially censoring the students, potentially censoring our researchers by saying that we're upholding this legislation. And Haynes and Patty are writing about how it requires university staff to act as agents of the state. So you're essentially becoming a police officer within your own educational institution. And there are questions to be asked about whether it's the role of the university to be reporting students to the police for things like reading certain books. You know, what are their borrowing histories? What are they talking about in classes? If it's not causing harm to a student within the room, or it doesn't have the potential to hurt somebody or silence their voice, then this is a discussion that ties into wider discussions about safe spaces within universities. And this is something that, you know, Independent's reporting on today in terms of universities saying, actually, Joe Johnson's wrong to say that we are censoring people and that we're removing books from libraries, and there's no evidence that any of this has happened, and there's no evidence that no platforming policies are doing anything bad in universities, that you don't understand this. The real question is Prevent. If you're looking at silencing and chilling of freedom of speech on campuses in the UK, you want to be looking at the Prevent requirements. That's the real problem. So some examples of stuff that is going on and that's been reported. A 16-year-old was reported to Prevent for borrowing a book on terrorism from the school library in universities. An international politics student was reported to the police. I think it was security staff, not library staff, but it was in the library that this took place. So when you're reporting students to the police for having taken a book that's freely available on your shelf and reading it, there are questions to be asked about what is this saying, what culture is this creating on campuses, what culture is this creating in university libraries, how do people feel, how is it making people scared and not feel safe and not feel trust, like they can trust the librarian and like they can trust the library space. And if we're going to talk about libraries being really positive spaces that are neutral and that people feel they can come and investigate all the world of thought, then we need to look at the policies that are underpinning what we're doing, because the students know about this. This is all over the media. This is something that's affecting them on a daily basis. So they do hear, you know, these stories. So this student at Staffordshire had said that this could be serious for him and that he could be on a list, and then he's scared about the implications of that in his daily life from now on. You know, if he tries to go to a different country, is that something that security is seeing at the border? But he's also worried that this can happen to anybody, well, not anybody, another young Muslim lad. So it is a scary thing for people, and they're carrying this with them. Rights Watch had reported, this is a really good report actually, it's to do with secondary education, but they're talking about teachers feeling like they're self-censoring. So it's not just the students who are saying, oh, you know, I don't feel like I can pipe up and say this in class, or I don't feel like I can search for things and educate myself on certain topics for fear of being reported. It's the teachers themselves are scared to talk about certain topics. And I think this is happening at a higher education level as well, that you just avoid talking about something or going there. If it's mentioned in a seminar group, you might just not talk about the fact that, you know, this has been brought up. Change the topic very quickly. People are scared to talk about difficult subjects. And it's not because they're scared of being reported for violating a safe spaces policy. That's ridiculous. It's because they're scared of being reported to the government for stoking anti-government sentiment. So as well as the prevent strategy, things that are going on a daily basis on university campuses, internet filtering, it's a big thing that I don't think there's... I know there are a couple of public library authorities across the UK that don't have any internet filtering at all, but beyond that, every single one does some degree of filtering. It happens in schools, it happens in colleges, it happens in universities, for very good reasons, but the impact can have some very damaging effects. So I was involved in some research with the Radical Librarians Collective, where we did freedom of information requests across every local authority in the UK to find out what they were filtering, what websites people couldn't get on public library computers, what websites specifically were being blocked, what people were doing when they came across that barrier, and whether they were asking for the policy to be changed or for access to those specific websites. The answer to what's being blocked a lot of the time is anything within this category, which is really broad strokes, really unspecific, really limiting. In terms of what people are doing to get through those barriers, it's nothing. Because they partly don't know that they can, they don't necessarily know that they can ask for that filter to be taken off, and partly because they might be embarrassed to do it. So even if they knew that that would probably be all right, it was a sensitive topic that they didn't feel like they could ask for the filter to be removed. So one example that a colleague of mine uses a lot is he works in a research library, a reference library, and there was one member of the public who uses the public library computers for researching female genital mutilation. And he works campaigning against that. And he one day had searched for something, couldn't get on it because it was blocked for sex and obscenity or something, the general specific standardised filter. And he went up to Alan and went, oh, this is blocked, what do I need to do? Alan went, oh, you need to report it to IT, can you do that? He said, yeah, I'll email, no problem. And I think it was removed within a week, but he eventually could get there. The problem is that with that man felt confident that he could go and ask for that to his fellow white librarian behind the desk. He had the language to go and ask IT to fix this thing. Not all of our users are that confident, they don't feel that free, they don't necessarily have the agency to be able to get through that barrier. And this prevents freedom of inquiry. So if you're putting barriers in place, whether that's the knowledge that they're being surveilled, or the knowledge that they can't necessarily get through a barrier, or the knowledge that that filter is being reported to somewhere. So every time they hit that barrier, there's a report sent somewhere and someone knows that you've been searching for this thing. It creates a sense that you're being watched. Sometimes people literally are being watched. So there's examples from the States of universities monitoring online behaviour with the potential to report them for dissent against their university or the government. So there was an example in the article that's linked to through that. These slides are going to be online later. But this example was somebody, a male student, had written a blog post disagreeing with something that his university was doing. They had then asked him to please remove it. They didn't like what was being said. So it's not just that you know you're being watched, it's that you know you're being watched and that if somebody disagrees with what you're saying, they can ask you to not say it anymore, please. So it is stifling discussion. In terms of what third-party services are doing, we often don't know. I'll talk a little bit about this in a bit. But we use a lot of third-party services. We outsource a lot of what we're doing in academic libraries and library services generally. And there's some really dodgy stuff going on when you start looking at it. And it's a bit worrying. I think we need to know that. We need to know whose stuff we're buying and what bad stuff they're doing, and then challenge them for doing it when it is counter to our academic values and our values of librarianship. And learning analytics is an example of what we're doing to try and do positive things in the university. You know, we're really keen to use learning analytics in a positive way, but there are negative implications of collecting this amount of data and then not really knowing what we're doing with it. So in terms of the internet filtering, just going back to that, although internet filtering itself isn't itself a form of surveillance, like I said, the reports that get generated automatically from that can be seen as a form of surveillance. And although a lot of what we do in terms of monitoring is just, you know, walking the floor and having a check, from a public libraries context, often that's just checking that there isn't a bloke in the corner looking at porn. But there are kinds of surveillance that goes on with checking the activity histories. And it does exist for a reason. Acceptable use policies are important, but we know from research that most people who are signing up to use a library service and to use library computers aren't reading the acceptable use policy in the first place. Where it does exist, it can be really long, it can be completely unintelligible. A colleague of mine, David McMenemy, is doing some research around this in public libraries to try and make acceptable use policies something that are actually useful and valuable and empowering to the library user, because it should be about not only what we want from our users and the limitations we're placing on them, you know, please don't do this on our computers or we'll kick you out and ban you. It's about what you can expect from us. So we won't send your browsing history to a third-party provider. We won't give your email address to marketing. What you can expect from us is a library that creates that trust. And, you know, you can put in there explicitly, we need to check every now and then. You know, we check this many things on this regular basis so that people don't feel that paranoia and that worry about being surveilled. And they know that when they are being surveilled, it's for these purposes and only these purposes. You can also talk about things like, in the States, there's such thing as a warrant canary. So you put that up on your website or in your library saying, the FBI hasn't requested your reading data from us. As soon as that canary goes down, you know that potentially they actually have, because you're not allowed to say we've had a request from the FBI that, you know, to give your data to them. But you can not be saying it every day. So there are things you can do that create that sense of trust and more of a community in your library through things like acceptable use policies. So this is an example of a social media monitoring program, Due Diligence. So this was a blog post critical of the NSA written by a student that the university is enforcing essentially NSA policy. They'd rather not have that up there. And this is based in the States, but I kind of feel like academic libraries in the UK, most libraries generally, are a few years behind what's going on in the US, and I think we need to look to the US in terms of the disenfranchisement of citizens that's going on, people literally having the vote removed from them, the right to vote, people literally being asked to leave the country, we can expect some dark stuff coming our way in the next few years, and I think we need to prepare for that. Surveillance cameras and video analytics, we're already doing this on UK campuses, but I think it's going to become more widespread and just the norm. We're already using ID cards, and we're using it in some positive ways to try and track what students are doing on campuses, where they're going, what times of day are the most popular, how we can develop our services to best meet student needs. But in the wrong hands, this data can be used in very negative ways, in ways that don't empower students, in ways that can actually make people feel like they don't have the freedom to move around a space that should be there for them, that they should feel part of a community, they should feel like they can do what they need to do, say what they want to do freely, to best get, it's partly student experience, but it is about being able to write freely and be a member of an academic community. It's very pretty. And I think this speaks to what Meredith was talking about this morning in terms of, sorry, it wasn't Meredith, somebody said this morning how Cambridge is kind of ahead of the curve and leading the way in terms of setting examples for the rest of the UK. With you having the power to do something and set an example and be leaders. And I think a lot of that is increasingly going to be about saying what we refuse to do. Not just we jumped on this new technology and we did it because it meant that we could increase the user experience, improve the user experience, because we could find out more about our students, because we could do this stuff, because we could get money in and generate income. It should be about setting a line in the sand and saying, no, this is where our boundaries are. We're not going to cross that. We're not going to violate our students' privacy. We're not going to make people feel unwelcome. We're going to set a standard, and we're going to hold ourselves to that standard. And professionally, I think librarians here could be engaging in this kind of discussion and debate and saying, we as professionals are setting a standard for ourselves, and we'd like to spread that throughout the country. I think somebody needs to lead it, and I think there's a bit of a gap. In terms of third-party services, Barbara Pfister had written about Adobe Digital Editions as an example. Just of, this is the stuff that we buy. Loads of university libraries use Adobe Digital Editions. They know exactly what books are being read, by whom, when, what pages are looked at, all linked to specific user IDs. On the one hand, fine. I mean, it shows how popular certain books are. It can help you inform your buying policies, what it is you want to get hold of. But Adobe themselves transmitted this information over the internet and hadn't encrypted it. So you can get hold of that. Specific user IDs can be connected to individuals. It's not secure, it's not private, it's not something that is encouraging people to trust the university library. And yeah, there probably aren't that many students who read about this and connected it to their own reading history and felt worried about it, but it's just an example of something that can very, very easily happen, that erodes trust, that makes people feel like they're potentially being surveilled, not necessarily by the university, but by somebody else. And this disproportionately affects people who already have a history of being marginalised or feeling that their own data needs to be protected. And it's just another thing. I mean, it's all another kind of straw on the camel's back for making people feel like they can't go out and talk freely about things. This I found out about last night, so very quickly changed my slides. There's a brilliant librarian in the US called Fabazia Attar, and she's written a piece about vocational awe in librarianship, and I love it. I've got a link to it at the end, but she's connected it to this issue of, if we talk a lot about how the librarianship profession really values freedom of speech and freedom of expression and freedom of inquiry, and we have these brilliant neutral spaces where everybody can come and feel welcome, and then we buy products like LexisNexis, who are enthusiastically signing up to the US Immigration and Custom Enforcement to look at the potential, so pre-crime, people doing bad things, whether they intend to commit criminal or terrorist acts, which the states themselves have said, we don't know if it's legal, we don't care, we're doing it until we get told that we can't. Then if we as a profession are just buying this stuff uncritically and not saying, hey guys, go in and do that, it's a problem. In terms of learning analytics, as I've mentioned, it's used for things like correlations between library use and student success. That sounds great. That helps us advocate for increased resources for the library. If students use libraries more, they will do better. Tracking library use to find out when you need to increase your opening hours or decrease your opening hours if you're having your funding cut. Tracking student staff location and movement to inform your user experience development or predict the success or failure so you can intervene at certain points sounds great. Regardless of the methodological limitations of that, that data can only tell you so much. And when you're using quantitative data in this way, you are ignoring a lot of things. It's only giving you half a story. So although there are positives to it in terms of predicting problems and planning, I think we need to be a bit more critical about what we're doing with learning analytics and just plan in advance. So if we're going to use data in this way, we need to plan what we're doing with the data and what it's actually telling us and whether it's worth collecting in the first place, if it's ever going to be powerful enough to tell you something. And if you don't think it's good enough, then don't collect it. Don't turn that on. Don't open that door of risk for the students, because there's a potential that actually collecting that and students knowing that you're collecting that will have more of a detrimental effect than anything positive you could ever achieve from doing research of that kind. So, have a drink. So there's very, very little at the moment out there about the actual impact that Prevent's having. Partly because the people who feel that they've been victimised because of Prevent and because of other surveillance strategies don't want to talk about it. They don't necessarily feel safe in talking about it. There's a lot of ongoing stuff that prevents people from talking about it in the first place at all. And it's very hard to tell who's being silenced, because the whole point is you don't know where they are, you don't know who's not talking, you don't know whose voices you're not hearing. And whenever you do research around freedom of expression, it's often people who feel very happy to make their voices heard, who are the people to sign up to surveys and to do interviews and to talk to you about that kind of thing. But theoretically, kind of a theoretical foundation for it that I draw on a lot is the Panopticon. And it's a bit boring and everybody's a bit sick of Foucault, but I think it's really relevant because it's a very simple idea and it's a very powerful one, that the potential of being observed has a disciplinary force. Whether or not you are actually being surveilled, the knowledge that you might be still means that you don't do the things that you would otherwise do. So this comes from Jeremy Bentham's idea of the prison, where you've got a security guard, a prison officer in the middle, and all of the cells are around, and the room that he's in, you can see 360 degrees. So you can be watching any one of those prisoners at any one time. You can't be watching all of them all the time, but the fact that you might be watching them means that they behave better than they otherwise would have done, theoretically. And Rise Up, they kind of are anti-surveillance, and they talk about the knowledge of always being watched changes your behaviour and stifles your dissent. So it's a very good way of stopping people from disagreeing with organisations and powerful bodies. And that could be a university. So if you feel like you'll be told, no, you can't host this event, you can't have this discussion, because we might turn around and report you to Prevent for doing so. It stops that discussion from happening in the first place, and it means that people will just stop asking you. And again, this is connecting back to being a trusted organisation. So in terms of the research that's been done, PEN America, which is the American arm of PEN, did a study in 2013 with writers across the states, all different types of writers, from poets, novelists, investigative journalists, about whether they felt that the NSA surveillance program in the States, the government surveillance, made them more or less likely to explore particular topics and what they were doing in response to it. So 1 in 6 of them had said that they thought they would avoid particular topics. So people just stop asking certain questions because they think it's too risky. They also stop using social media, communicating as much. They stop searching for things because the web searches are being potentially recorded and searched. And emailing, they would stop emailing. particularly contacts that they needed to keep anonymous because they feared for their safety of their contact internationally. So of those people aware in a Pew Internet study of surveillance programs, 34% of people had said that they were doing various different things to withdraw. So people are withdrawing from freedom of expression and freedom of inquiry. They're not searching for things. They're not talking as much. And this is the research that we did off the back of the American study. Nick Williams from Scottish Penn and David McMenemy and I did a similar study, advanced the survey that had been done in America, and we were finding, and we did some interviews as well, we were finding that people were avoiding writing and speaking on particular topics. They do think that surveillance, so this is in relation to the IP Act, the Investigative Powers Act in the UK, people are scared, they're not doing things, they are withdrawing from discussion. Only some of them are actually doing things to protect themselves. So people don't search for things. There's a Penny study that had found that people, particularly young people and women, are most likely to self-censor when they're scared of being surveilled. This has a chilling effect, and it contributes to this spiral of silence. So it causes people to self-censor, and they're not dissenting. And it contributes to the silencing, particularly of minority views. So people who feel protected and like nothing will happen to them if they just shout their mouth off don't stop talking, but people who are scared of the negative impacts of surveillance do stop talking. And we were finding that people were withdrawing from discussion and engaging in self-protective behaviour. So, in my last 5 minutes, the things that I think we need to do to respond to this is reflecting on our professional values. We need to look at what it is we say we do as librarians. I've been talking a lot about trust, and I think it's really important to have that with our communities. We need to support students, because one of the key things that we were finding in the Penn research was that even the people who were really keen to say that they felt like their freedom of expression was being affected by surveillance didn't feel like they had the skills and the agency to protect themselves. People in libraries need to engage with research around this, because we don't actually know, like I said, we know that prevent's having negative effects in schools. There's little evidence about what kind of an impact it's having on freedom of expression, and being able to use that and draw on that in terms of evidence-based practice and saying, here's our stance on this thing, and we know that we can do this and that it's the right thing to do because, our communities are saying they don't want it. We're informing them about it. We're supporting them to learn about it, and they don't like it, and we're not going to do it. And we don't think it's in the interest of academic freedom. And to consume and provide responsibly in terms of those third-party providers. So just, as a reminder, this should be our bread and butter. 3 of Gorman's library values are intellectual freedom, privacy, and democracy. And I think that surveillance, like the prevent legislation, not legislation, I keep calling it legislation, the prevent rules stuff, the recommendations, strategy, it's directly counter to this intellectual freedom, privacy, and democracy thing. And the ALA talks about the fact that protecting user privacy is necessary for intellectual freedom. It's fundamental to our ethics. And whether or not you believe in universal library values, I think those are important things to be aware of. Whether or not you believe in SILIP, I think it's important to be aware of the idea that libraries should have a concern for the public good. And I think prevent and other forms of surveillance are counter to the public good. So if you're interested, it's worth engaging, reading more, finding out what's going on, and challenging professional bodies and different organisations to actually write something about it, do something about it, have a stance on it. Sorry. Yeah, focus. Good. So Barbara Pfister again is talking about the fact that academic librarians need to consider how important privacy is to you as an individual and in your organisation. Look at how using data could be really harmful to freedom of expression. And we need to protect member privacy whilst we're doing research, whilst we're looking at learning analytics, whilst we're doing various things with WYSI technologies. This is an example of professional discussion. So SILIP had hosted a debate. I think universities themselves can be hosting debates like this at professional engagement events. Supporting students. These are some quotes from participants in the study that I did. I was interviewing writers, and they were saying that they feel exposed and vulnerable. They feel like they need some more support. So Scottish Pen does workshops in public libraries, public events, to help train people up in terms of privacy and security, how you can prevent people accessing your data, how you can protect yourself. I think universities need to be doing that as part of information literacy education, because it's no longer so much about the content. Well, it's still about the content, but it's also about people protecting their own data, and nowhere else is going to teach them. Really? Yeah. Also this.
Thank you very much. Sorry, I hate timekeeping. I always feel like I was shimming along. That's very, very interesting. Thank you so much. So we have some time for. We have some time for Lauren to cough for a little while, but we also do have some time for questions, and I hope there are many, because I found that talk absolutely fascinating. Terrifying, but fascinating.
Sorry.
No, it's good terrifying, if that makes sense, being aware of these things. So, who would like to start us off? Patricia, I'll just bring you the microphone.
Thanks. That was a really, really timely presentation. Without putting you on the spot, one of the things that we're obviously very focused on at the moment in libraries and public organisations is the GDPR. Do you think that's a positive or a negative issue in this context? And if it's neutral, how do you think we might be able to use it to strengthen our position?
I haven't got as far as connecting GDPR to what I'm thinking about. But I think it has the potential to be a really positive thing, because it's about making sure that organisations are being more responsible with the data that they collect. But I think a lot of organisations are, because of time constraints and because of expertise perhaps within the organisations, they're kind of going, right, we'll outsource this management of this issue to a consultant, and they'll tell us that we're GDPR compliant, and then we can put that on our documentation, and then everything's fine. I think it can be used as a discussion point with your users, so you can say, this is how we're using your data, this is how we're storing it, we're making sure it's stored securely, we're being responsible. And you can ask questions about what being responsible looks like in practice. I would hope that if you identify shortfalls, that there's then the financial support or the bringing in of expertise to help manage that in positive ways. But there's the potential, I don't know. It could go really well if it's supported properly, but it could just be another thing that's used badly.
I mean, I think the university is being really thorough about this. And so I suppose where I thought about it was particularly in the context of learning analytics. Certainly our University Information Service, our computing service, has always been incredibly good about making sure that data is anonymized. If you ask for any kind of data use, it's anonymized very thoroughly. So even if you're getting down to a small data set, they get extremely nervous and they say you shouldn't do anything about it. So when you come to ask students to sign up, to warn them that they're going to be using learning analytics, there is an opportunity there to explain how the data is going to be used. So there's some really good things we could be doing.
Yeah.
And perhaps that's one of the topics we can explore with our professional organisations is, how should we be using the data and how can we make it as anonymous as possible?
Yeah, and I think that needs connecting to a lot of ethical principles and a lot of kind of social science research principles, because a lot of the time, no matter how anonymous you make the data, so in terms of the methods of state surveillance, it doesn't matter how anonymised it is, you can still use that metadata in very powerful ways to identify people or to know what it is they've been saying, even if you can't read the content, for example. So just because something's anonymised, it doesn't mean someone's secure or safe. So you have to think about what that looks like when you've done analysis. Can people still be identified afterwards? So yeah, like as you said, it could be a small sample, and it doesn't necessarily mean just because it's anonymous that it isn't identifiable.
And the other thing I wanted to say quickly is, I mean, we understand there's this trade-off of, we can improve your learning experience by retaining data on, so we had this project we wanted to do a few years ago about, people who got first-class degrees read this kind of book or read this particular set of books. Mm-hmm. We thought that'd be fantastic. You could market it. So we never actually got around to doing that again because of concerns about data privacy. But there's huge pressure from our library users to retain data on what they have read for their convenience. And it's being able to go back to them and say, actually, have you thought about who could use this data? And I've always erred on the side of, I really don't want to hold on to that data.
Yeah.
But there's certainly a lot of pressure now from students to say, actually, I really want to know what it was I read back in first term.
Yeah, definitely. And I personally, as a library user, was really frustrated when I couldn't find, I put this request in, and what was it? I can't remember the thing I needed. I think with personalisation now, there's the option for opting in to that, perhaps. It might be a way forward to go, if you want this thing, as our blanket policy is we don't do it because our interests are protecting you and protecting your privacy and your security. If you would like this add-on, it's free, just ask us, then you know it's there. Because you find out who wants it when they come and ask you, why can't I find out my reading history and my lending history? So, there's a way of spinning that in a positive way that's saying, we're looking out for your individual interests and we have these tailorable services, perhaps.
Thank you.
Hello. Oh, thank you. That was really interesting. It's resonated a lot of things recently as well, especially with that, what universities do with the Holocaust denial literature as well, and what happens with that, and picked up on your anti-government sentiment, the discussions we should be having with students, and the freedom of expression, obviously, and one thing I've been sort of thinking, it's really a thought, really, maybe more than a question at this stage, but why aren't the government agencies going after the internet providers that are actually the platform for this, and instead they're going out after individual users, which is probably easier for them. But to me it seems to be that the problem is actually with the internet provider that's hosting the platform for the information, whatever website that could be in, it can be arguably, promoting this, that, or the other.
Yeah, I think I know what you mean. So for example, why aren't they taking down the Martin Luther King website that we all use as an example of unreliable information on the internet? And I think it's money. I think it's as soon as internet providers start saying we've got some kind of social justice imperative, it's not in their interest, it's not in their commercial interests, because they are commercial outlets.
The Google one-page effect is having an impact on it.
Yep.
Sorry, the Google one-page effect is having this major impact on it, then that our users don't look beyond the other search results, and there's people like Google actually are acting as the police themselves, right? So,
arguably, yeah.
Thank you. Yes, just. Oh, okay. Just,
Hi. I was really not shocked, but surprised about the LexisNexis mention you had there, and also Adobe Digital Editions, which are, of course, both things that we have here. And I was also thinking, I was mulling over while you were talking about things like Facebook and Twitter, and it sort of relates a bit back to what Peter was just saying about the web more generally. I mean, these social media apps, they just collect data from us. They are just mining data from us. That's why they're free, and that's what they do. And I think most people do understand that, but I guess most people don't understand the sort of things you're talking about. I think it's almost beyond the jurisdiction of a library, of a university, because that's in the wider world. I mean, for example, there's been this what I thought was a scaremongering thing recently, where computers, I think it was Macs mainly,
yeah.
were supposed to be listening in, and I was laughing about it. And then, as you can hear, I've had the flu over Christmas, and we had this horrendous incident in my house where we are Luddites. We have a smart TV that's not been enabled for the internet. We don't switch our phones on. And the laptop that my husband's writing his PhD on was on the table in the dining room, and I was coughing my head off. It was switched off. And he mentioned maybe he should go to the chemist to get me some Strepsils. And then the following day, he switched it on, and all of the adverts on Google were about flu, cold, Strepsils.
It all feels like too much of a coincidence.
And I said, but everybody's got the flu at this time of year. It's a coincidence. And he said, it's a bit weird.
Yeah.
And I don't know whether that's true or not, whether these devices can listen in, but I do know there have been, I've got a clipping on my desk about a doll that was listening in to children, so I do know it's possible. And
yeah, the Internet of Child things is terrifying.
I mean, I think in some ways, I can see that there might be a point where we could think about, I didn't know Adobe Digital Editions and what it was collecting was, how are we supposed to know all this stuff? And how does it fit into the wider world where this is going on? We sort of know it's going on. Well, what can we do other than switching the devices off? And even that apparently isn't enough.
I think money really talks. And that's the thing. If you say, you've messed up, they don't have a monopoly. These organisations are very big and very powerful. But at the moment, monopolies don't exist. And I think you can, not as an individual university necessarily, but as a consortium or as, a country, say we have these expectations of our providers, and if you aren't meeting these standards, and if you're doing these things, then we won't be buying your product. Thank you very much. That might be naive and it might be unrealistic, but I don't think we've tried it. So it might be worth a stab.
Well, first of all, you need everybody to be aware, and you need,
yes.
you need people to coordinate that. It's a bit like the whole business with Elsevier, isn't it? Where in Germany they've decided not to renew it.
Yeah.
That's a coordinated, but it needs to be global because of the reach that Elsevier has. So I think that's a bit utopian.
Yeah, but on a personal level, I think we have a responsibility to be aware of things, and you can, it's like there's no such thing as ethical consumerism, but you can be informed about things and be knowledgeable and be prepared to tell your students and be honest with them about the dilemmas that you have. Not necessarily you. I'm not saying you as an individual have to do all of this stuff, but I think we, on some kind of community level, need to be able to have these discussions, and we can't just uncritically buy stuff. It's not good enough. We have to do something. I just don't know what that something looks like and what the most strategic way to do it is. And I kind of feel like there's a bit of a leadership gap with that for the profession. How do we navigate these very difficult situations? So I'd like to see some kind of professional level action on it.
Okay, thank you.
I think we have time for one very quick question, possibly. Is it not a quick question? Just wait for the microphone. Yeah.
It's just an observation on that, really, that in a lot of cases with electronic resource providers, there is a monopoly in that you can't get it from anywhere else.
Yeah.
And just taking e-books, for example, a large number of the e-books that we buy now download to Adobe Digital Editions, and there may be an alternative, it may be a lot more expensive, or there may be no alternative. So it's very difficult to say, no, we're not buying that because of these possible issues. So it would need someone to put pressure onto the providers, or I don't know how it would be done, but it's very difficult to contemplate boycotting some of these things because they're not available in alternative versions.
Yeah.
So it's,
and that's what they're banking on.
Yeah.
I don't know. I'm not an expert in DRM stuff, so I can't say, you just go and strip the thing and do the thing. I'm not in a position to tell people what to do, but I have some concerns about the implications of it, and I think they're potentially very significant implications that we're in the early days of.
It's very interesting, and I hadn't thought about it at all, but it's hard to see what you would do, really. Yeah.
So I think it's the beginning of a conversation about it, and hopefully if people, if you say, I wasn't aware of this, now I am, might dig into it further and see what's going on.
We are almost out of time. So, yes, I think I will draw this to a close. Thank you very much, Lauren. It was a really, really interesting
Thank you
talk.
for having me.
Some great questions, so thank you, everyone, for asking them. So, yes, another round of applause for Lauren Swift, please.